I had never felt pain like this before. One moment I was going about my day, and the next, a searing, unbearable pain tore through my lower abdomen. It wasn't a dull ache or a cramp. It was sharp, relentless, and suffocating. I collapsed onto the couch, clutching my side, struggling to breathe through the agony. I knew something was seriously wrong. My body was screaming at me, and no position, no amount of deep breathing made it better. When the nausea hit and I broke out into a cold sweat, I realized I couldn't just wait it out. I needed help. Jake, my husband, was in the other room. When I called for him, he walked in, his expression immediately shifting from neutral to concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked, but I could barely form the words. "Hospital," I managed to gasp. The drive there felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road sent fresh waves of pain through me. My fingers dug into the seat, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. I could see Jake glancing at me, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. But he didn't say much. That was typical of him. He wasn't the overly emotional type. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. The doctors ran tests, gave me pain meds that barely took the edge off, and finally, after what felt like hours, confirmed what was happening. I had a ruptured ovarian cyst, 5 centimeters. The doctor explained that the pain was from internal bleeding and irritation, and that I needed rest to recover. I was exhausted, physically drained, and still in pain when I was discharged. All I wanted was to go home, get into bed, and let my body heal. Jake was quiet during the drive back, but I figured he was just processing everything. At that moment, I thought he understood how serious this was. I was wrong. Walking into our house felt both like a relief and a challenge. The hospital had been overwhelming. The constant beeping, the bright lights, the distant sounds of other people in pain. But now that I was home, the reality of my recovery settled in. Every movement sent sharp reminders of what had happened inside my body. Jake helped me to the couch, but there was an awkwardness to it. He wasn't the type to hover, which I usually appreciated, but right now I needed comfort. Instead, he stood there for a second, then nodded, almost as if checking off a box. "You need anything?" I hesitated. "Water." He brought it over and then sat down next to me. "So, what now? Do they give you meds or something?" "They said rest is the most important thing," I explained, shifting carefully to find a position that didn't send pain shooting through my side. "My body just needs time to heal." He nodded again, but didn't say much else. A minute later, he got up and went into the other room. The rest of the evening was quiet. I laid there, trying to breathe through the discomfort, while Jake went about his usual routine. He checked his phone, watched TV, and at some point, made himself dinner. He didn't ask if I wanted anything, but I was too exhausted to bring it up. I kept telling myself he just didn't know what to do. That night, as I struggled to sleep through the pain, I kept expecting him to check on me. But the only sound I heard was him lightly snoring next to me. It was the first time I felt a nagging sense of loneliness in my own home. The next evening, I was still feeling awful. Moving hurt, standing up was a challenge, and every time I shifted positions, I felt like my body was punishing me for it. I was exhausted, frustrated, and just trying to get through the pain 1 hour at a time. Jake walked into the room, and for a moment, I thought he was finally coming to check on me, maybe to ask if I needed anything. But instead, he started talking. "You know," he said, standing near the doorway, arms crossed, "I bet you'd be recovering faster if you were more active." I blinked at him, completely caught off guard. "What?" "I mean, it makes sense," he continued, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he used when he was convinced he was right. "If you were in better shape, your body would handle this stuff better. You'd probably heal quicker too." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process what he was saying. I was lying there, barely able to sit up without wincing, and he thought now was a good time to lecture me on my health? "Jake, that's not how ovarian cysts work," I said, my voice flat. He shrugged. I don't think that's true. I let out a dry laugh, half in disbelief, half in anger. Oh, you don't think that's true? You suddenly an expert in gynecology now? He didn't even blink. I just think being healthier overall would help you avoid stuff like this. I was so irritated I could barely see straight. I literally looked it up. I shot back. Better health wouldn't have prevented this. Sometimes cysts rupture. It happens. But Jake wasn't listening. He just kept going, talking over me, doubling down on his point like he was giving some motivational speech. I tuned him out, rolling my eyes and staring at the ceiling while he droned on about fitness and discipline. At some point, I stopped arguing. It was pointless. He was convinced he was right, and I was too exhausted to keep fighting. But as he left the room, I couldn't shake the anger burning in my chest. He thought he was helping, but all he was doing was making me feel worse. The frustration from the night before hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper into my chest, mixing with the discomfort I was already feeling. I kept replaying Jake's words in my head, each time making me angrier. By the time he walked into the room again that morning, I was still in bed, trying to force my body to cooperate. My movements were slow, careful. Just the act of getting up felt like a battle. Jake, on the other hand, looked like he was starting his day normally. He stopped near the door and, as if yesterday's conversation had never happened, started talking again. So, I was thinking about what we talked about, he said. And honestly, I still think I have a point. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. Jake, I don't want to do this again. I'm just saying, he continued, ignoring me completely. Fitness plays a huge role in recovery. It's why soldiers who are in shape bounce back from injuries faster. I clenched my jaw, already feeling the exhaustion creep in. Jake, I am not a soldier. This is not a muscle strain. It's a ruptured cyst. Internal bleeding. That's not something you bounce back from by running a few miles. His expression didn't change. But your overall health? I am not arguing with you about this, I snapped. I literally researched it. You being in the military doesn't make you a doctor. He exhaled sharply, like he was the one getting frustrated. I just think it's worth considering. Jake, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. I don't disagree that being healthy is important, but right now, I'm in the worst pain of my life. And you think this is the time to have this conversation? He hesitated, like the thought had just occurred to him. I mean, it's relevant, isn't it? You had to go to the hospital because of your health. His words hit me like a slap. I couldn't even respond. Because in that moment, I realized he wasn't seeing me as a person in pain. He was seeing me as a problem to fix. I thought that maybe, after shutting down the conversation, Jake would let it go. But I should have known better. Later that morning, I was slowly making my way to the kitchen, every step careful, my body still aching from the inside out. I had barely made it to the fridge when I heard his voice behind me. You shouldn't be pushing yourself too much, he said. I turned around, already tired of whatever lecture was about to come. I'm just getting water. That's not what I meant. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I just think that this whole thing could be a wake-up call for you. You know, to take your health more seriously. I stared at him, my patience wearing thin. Jake, I take my health seriously, but this has nothing to do with fitness. He shrugged. You don't know that for sure. I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. I literally do. I asked the doctor. I looked it up. This wasn't caused by poor health. It just happened. Instead of acknowledging that, he doubled down. All I'm saying is, maybe if you were more active, your body would have handled it better. And that was it. That was the moment I snapped. Are you serious right now? My voice was louder than I intended, but I didn't care. I am barely standing, Jake. I am in the worst pain of my life, and instead of supporting me, you're using this as an excuse to criticize me? He frowned, clearly not expecting that reaction. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying, No, you're not just saying anything. I cut him off. You're lecturing me. You're acting like this is my fault. I never said that. But that's how it feels, I shot back. Like you think if I had just worked out more, I wouldn't be lying here in pain. Do you have any idea how messed up that sounds? He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but for once he didn't say anything. Instead, he just looked at me, almost like he was considering my words. But the damage was already done. Jake didn't speak for a moment, and for a second I hoped, that maybe, just maybe, he was realizing how insensitive he was being. But then he sighed, shaking his head like I was the one being unreasonable. Look, he started, his voice calmer now, like he was trying to explain something to a child. I'm not saying this to be mean. I just think it's worth talking about because, well, it's obvious you weren't in great health. I blinked, genuinely speechless. Excuse me? I mean, he continued like he hadn't just completely insulted me. You had to go to the hospital. That doesn't just happen to healthy people. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. You think being in shape prevents ovarian cyst ruptures? You really believe that? He shrugged. I think taking care of yourself can prevent a lot of health issues. I stared at him, trying to decide if he was just ignorant or if he truly believed what he was saying. Jake, do you hear yourself? You don't know what you're talking about. This isn't some pulled muscle or an injury from lack of training. It's a medical condition, one that happens to all kinds of women no matter how fit they are. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I just feel like if I don't bring it up now, then when? You're obviously not in the best shape, and I never say anything about it. But now that it's affecting your health, I held up a hand, cutting him off. You think this is the right time? While I'm still recovering? While I'm in pain? You couldn't wait until I was actually okay to have this conversation? He frowned, like he didn't see the issue. I just thought it was relevant. I shook my head, feeling the anger tighten in my chest. No, Jake. What's relevant is that I needed your support, and instead, you made this about my body. And for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression, something like hesitation. But it was too late for that now. I was done arguing. My body hurt, my head was pounding, and I had nothing left to give. But Jake? He wasn't done. You know, he said after a long pause, I think you're just getting defensive because you feel insecure about this. I turned to him slowly, barely believing what I had just heard. What? He shrugged, like he hadn't just made everything 100 times worse. I mean, every time I bring up fitness, you get upset. It's not like I'm attacking you. I'm just talking about health. I stared at him, my hands curling into fists at my sides. Jake, I am in pain. Actual physical pain. This isn't about insecurity. This is about you choosing the worst possible time to talk about something that has nothing to do with what happened to me. He crossed his arms, his face unreadable. I just think if this wasn't a sensitive topic for you, you wouldn't be reacting like this. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh, so now my reaction is the problem. Not the fact that you've been lecturing me while I'm recovering from a medical emergency. He sighed, shaking his head. I'm not trying to fight with you. I scoffed. Could have fooled me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then finally, he seemed to realize I wasn't going to engage anymore. Fine, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Do whatever you want. And with that, he walked out of the room. I should have felt relieved that the conversation was over. But instead, all I felt was exhausted. After Jake walked out, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. My body still ached, but now there was a different kind of pain pressing down on me, one I couldn't just breathe through. I felt empty. I had spent the last 2 days trying to defend myself when all I wanted was support. But it was clear now, Jake wasn't going to see my side. He wasn't going to understand. So what was the point of talking? So I stopped. That night, when he came into the room and asked if I needed anything, I just shook my head. When he tried to make small talk over dinner, I barely nodded in response. And when he finally asked, "Are you mad at me?" I didn't even look up. At first, I think he thought I was just tired. But as the silence stretched into the next day, I could feel his frustration building. "You're really not going to talk to me?" he asked at one point. I just shrugged, still avoiding his gaze. He let out a sharp breath, like this was somehow difficult for him. "Come on, this is childish." I almost laughed. Childish? He had spent days lecturing me while I was in pain, making me feel worse when I was already at my lowest. And now he wanted to act like I was the unreasonable one? I didn't owe him a conversation. So, I stayed quiet. And with each hour that passed, I could feel the distance between us growing wider. The silence stretched between us like an invisible wall. Jake hated it. I could tell. He was used to me arguing back, pushing against him, but this time I had nothing left to say. The worst part was that he still didn't seem to understand why I was upset. It wasn't just about the lectures or his complete lack of empathy. It was about what it revealed. I started thinking back to our relationship as a whole. Jake had always been structured, disciplined. That military mindset shaped everything about him. And for the most part, I had admired it. But now, I was realizing something painful. He didn't know how to be soft. He didn't know how to set aside his opinions to simply be there for me. Everything was a lesson, a problem to solve, a moment to assert what he thought was right. Even when I was at my lowest, he couldn't just comfort me without turning it into some kind of performance about health and fitness. And that made me wonder, had he ever really been the supportive partner I thought he was? Or had I just ignored the signs until now? The more I sat with that thought, the heavier it became. It wasn't just about this one fight. It was about all the other times he had dismissed my feelings, all the moments where I had let things slide because it was easier than arguing. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure I could keep doing that. The silence between us remained. Jake stopped asking if I was okay, stopped trying to start conversations. I think he thought I would break first, that I would apologize, or at least go back to normal. But I didn't. Because I couldn't. I wasn't just mad. I was hurt. I had been through one of the most painful experiences of my life, and instead of being there for me, my husband had used it as an opportunity to lecture me. He had minimized my pain, ignored my feelings, and then blamed me for getting upset about it. And now he wanted me to feel guilty for shutting down. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out if I had overreacted. Maybe I should have just brushed it off. Maybe I should have been more patient, explained it better, made him understand. But why was that my responsibility? Shouldn't he have just cared? So now I ask you, am I the asshole for shutting him out while I recover? Should I have handled things differently? Or was I right to expect more from the person who was supposed to support me?